headphones on. That's good.
Yeah, it's very weird to be talking to a group and not being able to hear.
Yeah,
So
we're talking before. It's a little bit like going back to the digital times and COVID. But we're here, so that's good. My name's Nathan. I've got Justin here with me as well.
hey, everybody.
Today we're just going to talk a little bit about how to craft the perfect pitch. One of the things we put perfect here in commas is because you'll get a bunch of advice from us, and then you'll go to someone else, and they'll tell you something slightly different, and you'll go to the next person, you'll hear something slightly different again. This is a very challenging part of being in video game development, is knowing which pieces to hold on to and which to let go of. But we'll do our best to kind of make this informative nonetheless. We're going to start by just talking a little bit about what you want. It's really important as a studio to have a vision of who you are and what you want to do first and foremost. From there we can talk a little bit about understanding investors, how they think, things that they're looking for.
So quickly, so when we say investors, we're using investors and publishers as the same in this case. They are different. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but just know it's both. It
is both, yeah. We use them interchangeably, but they're not interchangeably. But for the purpose of brevity here, that's what we're going with. We'll jump into the pitch, some slides you need. We've got some examples of good slides, we've got some examples of bad slides, so hopefully that's interesting. And then we'll finish just by talking a little bit about how Xsolla can help you. So when we think about what you want, most people immediately just say, well, I'm looking for money. And that can be true, but really what we encourage you to think about is, well, what is the money going to allow you to do as a studio? What is the creative time that it buys you, and how are you using that time to make the studio what it is that you want to become? And really what this is getting at is the why, as we've been talking about. Why are you doing this? And that can be boiled down into your vision, right? And you really need to start with this core vision, because this is how you're going to align with the right investment opportunities, and this is how you're going to put your pitch deck into the world with a real chance of success in that regard. So I've just put one together here, is we want to build indie games that fuse Baltic mythology with brutal survival and crafting gameplay. Alright, so that's a vision. That's who this studio wants to become. And the reason to really think about this is because you need to connect your vision with the right publishers and investors. And an analogy we kind of joke around with a little bit is, a sumo wrestler and a ballet dancer are both athletes, but they have very different nutritional requirements, right? If the ballet dancer starts eating like a sumo wrestler,
they're going to look like me.
They're going to look like Justin, but they're also not going to be very effective when it comes to their performance. And this is kind of the key thing. Your vision and your funding really need to align, because if you're looking in the wrong places with the wrong message, you're going to have a very, very long and very, very unsuccessful time raising the capital.
So I think this goes to doing your homework on who you're pitching to. Are they an investor? Are they a publisher? Which one do you want to work with? Because not all money is the same. We'll dig into that a little bit more, but it's super important that you understand there's a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, understanding investors and publishers. So this is a little bit, how do you think like a publisher? One way to think about this is, I've recently become a father, and I think our baby's great, but I don't expect anyone to care about our baby as much as I do. And publishers and investors, they look at a lot of babies. Your baby is your game, and what you've got to understand is the market is extremely competitive. So these are the games that shipped in 2022 on Steam, right? These are the games that made it. And we were talking at breakfast yesterday about that example with the publisher of how many pitches.
So one of the publishers I spoke with at GDC a little over a year ago said they reviewed about 1,400 pitches in 2021. They signed 2. So to put that in perspective, industry-wise, it's about 1% of all game pitches actually find funding or a publisher. Again, you have 10,000 here. We don't know how many games didn't get released, and this is also for PC. So if you look at console plus mobile plus everything, I think the rough number is 10 to 15,000 more, because a ton of those are on mobile that never see the light of day as well. So roughly 20 to 30,000 games a year are being released, and so that's who you're competing with.
Yeah. So it's very competitive. You don't want to be looking in the wrong spot if you can avoid it, as we spoke about. And this kind of comes to the next point with the alignment is, publishers and investors, they are all different. And they're going to have their own spaces They're going to have their own model and monetization requirements with games. And what's, I think, really important for everyone to take in here is, like, you can have a great game that's just not a good investment for them. Okay? So sometimes you're getting a no, and it's not because the game's not good. It's just it doesn't align with their portfolio and the types of investments they have a mandate to make. So this is, this seems quite obvious when you're pitching who is the audience, but it's very surprising how often we see pitch decks in the Funding Club that get this completely wrong. And of course, the audience is the investor or the publisher. Too often what we see is people kind of pitching to the players, right? So it's important to understand, your audience isn't a Reddit user. You're not trying to persuade these people to play your game. What you're really trying to do is persuade them to invest in your studio. And by an extension of that, you're presenting an investment opportunity. Now I know, especially for indies, hearing that your game is an investment opportunity sounds very difficult. It's not how you like to think about the time you spend being creative. And the advice I have is, when you're in this space of pitching, you just need to take that hat off for a little while, because if you can raise that money, it gives you the opportunity to be creative and build the games in terms that you really want. So I know it's not the thing that most people will get into the
It's not sexy.
For, but I can't stress how important this is to kind of meet the investor where they are, rather than trying to make them understand who you are all the time.
So I do want to point out, it doesn't mean don't know who your audience is going to be. That needs to be in the pitch. But your audience for the pitch is the investor or publisher. And it will change the way you focus your pitch quite a bit.
100%. Yeah, that's a great point. So with investors and publishers, there's typically two levers that they're looking to reduce their risk. What do I mean by that? There's two things that they want to be able to say yes to. So the first one is that there's an audience for this game, and they believe there's an audience for this game. The game's in the right positioning in the market. And then the other big lever is always going to be, can you ship this game, right? And can you ship the game that you're pitching, not just a version of that game, all right? And so the whole point of the pitch is to be reducing making them believe as much as possible in these two categories.
So I have a friend from a AAA studio that's released a ton of games, and his biggest thing is the difference between not shipping a game and shipping a game is light years. In the first game, about 80% of work is in the last 20% of development. And the people who've never shipped a game, this is why you have trouble that first time around. Most publishers and investors realize that they're putting 80% of the risk on a team that's never shipped something. So it doesn't mean that we don't sign games that have never, from companies that never shipped. It just means you have a bigger hurdle to prove that you can ship. And two things he always says that all developers are bad at are budgets and schedules. So keep that in mind, that the assumption from an investor and publisher is that you're going to be bad at these things. So the more confidence you can build that you're not, the more likely you are to get money.
Yeah, and every studio you love at some point, we're making their first game. So it's part of the process of, establishing yourself in this world. All right, this brings us to the fun part, the pitch. So when we think about the pitch, really, you need to understand what it is you want from the pitch. What you're not looking to do is get someone to write you a check then and there. That's very, very rarely going to happen.
That'd be great. I think I've seen 5,000-6,000 pitches in my life. I've never signed one the first day I saw it.
Yeah.
And most investors won't. They may get excited about it the first time, but your goal is always to get them to want to follow up, leave them wanting more, so then you can create a conversation and a relationship to make a deal.
Yeah, which is the next point, which is kind of make it hard for them to say no. When we talk about how many games they see, part of what you need to understand here is they're saying no a lot, as we had the example that you gave before, and it's kind of their job to say no, and what you're trying to do as much as possible is give them reasons to say yes. And yes in this context is really like, we want to know more about this studio or about this game. We want to find out more. This pitch has got our interest. There's enough here for us to explore this and move through those next stages.
Well, I think also none of us like to be sold, right? Nobody likes somebody running up, oh my God, I want to sell you this glass of water. So you want to create a conversation about, you know what, I have some really good tasting water. I see you might be thirsty. It's just a slightly different perspective on how you create that demand.
Yeah. And this is going to inform a lot of what goes into the pitch. And before we go through some of these examples, just because something's not in the pitch doesn't mean it's unimportant, right? A game design document shouldn't be in the pitch, but if you don't have a game design document or some pathway that you're going through, by the time you get that next conversation, the publisher's going to lose interest at that point. So don't confuse or conflate what shouldn't be in the pitch with something that's not important.
Perfect example is a full production plan, right? That doesn't necessarily need to be in the pitch. You'll see some key parts that are taken from a production plan, but the full one doesn't need to be in the first pitch.
Exactly, yeah. So elevator pitch. This should be something that captures the emotion of the game very, very quickly and really gets the people that are looking at this to think, wow, I'd really like to know more here. So we've got one sentence here, right? Remember when you were a kid and playing make-believe felt so real, it was hard to separate imagination from reality. This is a real-world example that we're quite familiar with. I don't know about you guys, but as soon as I read that, I was like, wow, I'm interested to know what's going to unfold in this pitch now. And I mean, Justin, you can talk a bit more to this.
So this is a game called Lost and Played that was actually, I helped sign, that was published by Joystick Ventures, and it immediately put me inside their head. So here's the problem that we have as publishers and investors seeing hundreds of pitches, right? They all begin to blend. So I used to think the idea of an elevator pitch was super cheesy because I worked in Hollywood a lot and I got really tired of really bad producers trying to get me to buy stuff. But after seeing thousands of pitches, what you're trying to do is immediately get that person inside of your head, because the quicker you can get them to see your vision for the game, the more likely they are to say yes to continue a conversation. It also then sets the mood for the rest of the pitch. So you don't necessarily have to have one of these, but it is super useful. It's a little different than an elevator pitch, but it really sets the mood for the rest of the pitch, and it can immediately get somebody, maybe I'm thinking that you're a studio that's making a first-person shooter. Well, that's not really what you're making, and so it sets the entire mood. So it's super important. I know teams that spend months and months and months ironing this out. It's worth every second.
Yeah, and it's hard, right? The easier thing to do is something like this, right? Now, this doesn't capture, when we talk about making it hard to say no, it's kind of easy to say no to this, right? Because I'm either short on time or I've got to really think about it. I've got to put too much time into understanding the vision.
And you may laugh, but I can't begin to tell you how many pitches we get that start like this.
Yeah, yeah. So this is not the elevator pitch. And again, it's not that these details aren't important. It's just not the right time to be putting this in front of the investor or publisher. So some key features you want to have. Core game loops, obviously quite important. Anything that makes this game different that you can tie into the core game loop or the meta game loop, super, super valuable. And what you're really looking is to just convince them of why people should play this game. Often this comes down to the USPs. And USPs are extremely difficult. They're very, very hard to get right. So we've got some examples here. And I think what's interesting about these is when we contrast them with what we would consider to be not great examples. So the point here is that they're quite specific and they focus on a particular game. And you'd be surprised when we see USPs how often we get things like this, which when you're first reading them seem quite compelling and quite interesting, but they're just a little bit void of any real information. And I think an interesting way to think about this is when you kind of take the opposite of this USP and throw that in here as well, right? And the point we're trying to make here is it may be an inspiring game, but nobody's running around pitching something that's uninspiring. And if your USPs are too bland like this, unfortunately, they just don't capture people the way that they should.
Well, we'll have a slide later, but you know what? If you end up in the middle, then you're really, nobody's for everybody, and by having a very generic term like that, you look like you're for everybody, which means you hit nobody.
Yeah. And credit to Rami Ismail for this.
Yes.
An article of his that I read, and we kind of incorporated that.
So those of you who don't know, and we'll mention some other resources, Game Discover, if none of you follow that or read that, absolutely sign up for Simon's newsletter. It's a resource that's amazing. He analyzes data from all kinds of games on Steam. Rami's got some great stuff from press kits. He presents stuff in a very different angle, but from a developer perspective who's seen and pitched a lot of games. And he has this thing on the anti-bullet points, and this is where some of this comes from.
Yeah. So positioning and market fit. Again, what you're trying to do here is show where your game fits into the market. And if you can visualize this with the right axes, this is a really quick way to just show the publisher or investor that you've thought about the space that you're operating in, you understand the market that your game's in, and you're making it very obvious to them where it is you fit in this market. Again,
and to be clear, we're not saying you should use these games.
Probably don't use these games. These are not indie games, obviously. Again, when we contrast this with a bad way of positioning this, you can have a kind of similar space, but it's quite easy to say no to this, because as a publisher investor, I just see that in every direction that you're selling me this game, there's something that is better. And it's quite subtle, because there can still be this space here, but just visually, it's going to look a lot less appealing to the publisher investor.
Well, I think the other problem is there actually really is no consumer in that space.
Right, yeah. Traction and progress, we can go through this one pretty quickly. It is really just anything and everything you've got that shows that you're moving in the right direction. When we talk about that risk of is there an audience for the game, anything you can show, whether it's your socials, your Discord, playtest feedback, what you're saying to the publisher is we have less risk here. There's an audience for this game.
Well, I'm going to say this. So as a publisher or investor, we're actually all pretty gun shy. And we also all want third-party validation. So if I invest a game that has a bunch of followers and all these wish lists and it doesn't do well, I can actually point the blame at everybody. If I invest a game that take 100% risk and it has no followers, none of this community, and it fails, everybody's like, you're an idiot. Why did you invest in that game? Yeah. So we actually, even investors and publishers, we have bosses too. We have people we answer to. And at a fund, I still have the investors in the fund that I have to explain why I made a bad investment. And if I can back it up with, well, they had all this stuff and it still failed, they might not be happy, but they understand. If I've got nothing to back that up, it's a good way to lose my job.
Yeah, absolutely. So comparable titles and sales. Here you're really just, again, you're trying to show what games are similar to your title. What are the different axes you're working in? What are the different genres that you're in? What's important to think about here is how you're positioning the different games next to your game. So typically you want to have, the lowest case at least 3 to 5 times your budget, closer to 5 times what you're asking for. And then you want to accelerate up from there, right?
So most publishers, investors run 3 P&Ls, and they will run their own P&L. So I have a lot of developers, why do I need to put this? Well, understand that I need to know who you're going for. I need to know what audience you're trying to hit, and then I have to believe you're hitting them. My job isn't to tell you what audience. My job is to figure out whether or not I believe you're hitting that audience, and I think I can help you. So it becomes super important for me to understand who your consumer is. The other way to think about this is if your game ships tomorrow, what are the players for your game playing today, and then why would they stop playing that tomorrow to play your game? And honestly, if you can't answer that to me in 30 seconds, you're probably not ready to get my money. Yeah. So it's really important, and people try to blow this off and not think, because yes, we will run our own P&Ls, but I still need to know where you think you stand and who your audience is. Pardon me? Oh, the question of what, the funding side, or I'm sorry. So the question is, if my game was to ship tomorrow, what are my players playing today, and why are they going to stop playing that today to play my game tomorrow? How am I convincing whatever audience I'm going after that my game has something better or different than the game they're currently playing? Right? Because that's my job, and as a developer, your job is to try to get somebody who's probably playing a game right now to stop playing that and play your game. So that's the way we think. Like, I have to get somebody, because I'm usually not creating a new audience. I'm usually not getting somebody, grandma sitting on the couch who's never played a game, to play a game. That's great if you can do that. Come talk to me. I want to see your game. But that's not usually going to happen. So what audience are you going after? What are they playing, and why are they going to play your game? I think we can get to a bunch more questions later. Let's specific on that.
Just a really short one. What's P&L?
Profit loss. So we can go into detail. We will be at our booth later on to explain a lot more of this. We have sample decks, but I want to make sure we can finish, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah. And again, hard to say no.
By the way, great question, though.
Yeah, hard to say no is give them a starting point. They are going to do their own research, but if the first place they look is here and they agree with that, harder to say no. Okay, so again, what this shouldn't be is we've got a 500K budget, and this is who we're comparing ourselves to, right? Unless you're trying to get, I don't know, an uncle that's not into gaming to invest, a rich uncle at that point, this isn't going to resonate because it's just not realistic for that type of budget.
And by the way, this is literally almost an exact slide from somebody who submitted a game not too long ago.
Yeah. So. Game details. This one's straightforward. This is just bare minimum information that you need to include. Often gets overlooked. Important to present in one slide. Again, hard to say no. Make it easy for them to get the information they need. There's more things you can add as well here. This isn't a kind of be-all, end-all, but that's a good place to start. Budget. Obviously, this is a big one. one of the things to always think about is the publisher investor over the course of the pitch, they're trying to connect some dots. And if they see too many little red flags, that can lead up to a big red flag. And with the budget, especially at this point, before you get to sending them the Excel spreadsheet with the detailed information, they just want to see that your ratios make sense. If you've got a live ops game, there's some factor in there for that. This one doesn't. So they're really just trying to verify that you've got an understanding of what it means to budget for a game. Okay?
So I'm going to step in here. So remember this, as an investor, sure, you're making a game, but I'm investing in your ability to run a business long enough to make the game. And it seems like a subtle difference, but it's super important. This is why you guys all have the hardest job in the business, because you have to try to build a game, which is a creative endeavor, and try to run a business at the same time. And often, it's only a few people doing that. But if I don't believe you can run a business, I'm not giving you money to build a game. And the other thing about this is super important, is the reason to do it something like this is because if you're pitching a publisher, they're probably going to do the QA localization ratings. If you're pitching an investor, they're probably going to want to give you the money for all of it. So rather than creating two complete decks, you can actually put it all in one deck and still answer the question. The other piece, the spent to date becomes super important because this becomes huge leverage. It reduces my risk, but it also gives you the opportunity to negotiate for a much better royalty rate. If I am taking 100% of the risk, you're probably going to get very little in royalty, and I'm probably going to take the IP. If you put in this much already, which is about 20%, then all of a sudden it completely changes the ratios. Plus, I'm going to trust you a lot more because I know you have real skin in the game, not just your idea and your baby.
And that can also be a reflection of your time, right? So if you've been working on this and you're not paying yourself, you need to come up with a figure here, but just be careful how this anchors their perception of the build that they playtest. Because if you tell them, I've spent 1.5 million on this, because you're paying yourself that much imaginarily, then they play the build, and it doesn't look like anywhere near that, then they just think you don't have skills, or you don't know how to manage that money. So don't get carried away with this, but don't undersell yourself if you've been putting your own time into this as well.
No, especially. So there's an expression in investing called pay yourself first. So again, if you are working on this and it's a hobby project, what would you be making at a relatively reasonable salary in your area? So don't take an LA salary if you live in Serbia, and make that the money that you should be paying yourself, and then put that into what's been put in before. Because if you're not going to give yourself credit, nobody else will.
Yeah. Which brings us to some bad budgets, and we do see this, unfortunately. Now's not the time to start offering bargains or saying, hey, we could make this game for 135, but actually there's a way we could do it for 300, but also there's these other features or levels that we could do for 730, right? And I can understand you're trying to make it cheap, or you're trying to give people an option to invest when maybe it doesn't fit their portfolio or whatever. But all you're doing here is kind of signaling, A, that you're not that confident in your vision, right? The game's going to cost what it's going to cost. And we believe in this game, and this is what's required to make the game that we think is going to sell the way we say it is. So you're just sowing doubt, and you're making it very difficult for the publisher or investor.
Yeah, I've got nothing else to add.
Timeline, I wouldn't get too caught up in exactly what's here. You can have different pieces to this. What's important is to visualize it as much as possible. Again, when we talk about these small red flags, they're looking for things that build over time. And, if they see something where you're saying, look, we're going to secure funding, and then the next month we've got a full team hired. Again, this is a small thing that's just demonstrating maybe this team doesn't really have the experience to do these things, or they haven't thought through this enough. A small one, but quite important to get right as well. So team and credentials, this one's pretty straightforward. This is really about who you are. Anything anyone on your team's worked on, even if it's not your studio, include it. This is your ability to prove that you can ship games, reducing that risk that this game's going to not ship.
Build confidence any way you can.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us quickly to how Xsolla can help. We have something called the Funding Club. This is a no-cost matchmaking platform. We help connect you with publishers and investors, free to apply. We playtest every build. We'll share some links at the end of how you can do that as well. So look, just to wrap this up quickly, obviously you need to build a business case. You need to prove that you can run a business for them. Really focus on getting a conversation. That's the goal of the pitch more than anything else. Pitching games is hard. I know it's not always in the wheelhouse of why you got into this, but if you're sitting here and you think you can make a game, I really think you can pitch a game as well. So if you're prepared to go through the slog of the development of a game, then you can absolutely do a pitch properly. So we've just quickly got a QR code here. We're doing a little raffle to join our indie mailing list. You can win a Steam gift card. We'll be at the booth all afternoon. So please stop by. We've got a bit of time for questions, I think, as well. So
that's it. Thank you very much.